Then let me introduce you to our third speaker of the second seminar series. So we are very happy and honored to have Allison Bishop today, who is giving career advice. I bet it will be interesting, and I'm hoping it will also be funny. And so we invited Allison also because she's one of the rare people who has both experience inside as well as outside of academia, which I think is very interesting to give career advice. And we also know Allison from being a person supporting diversity in the community since a long time on different aspects. So she has been supporting WinC since its creation. And Allison is also involved in CFAIL, which she created, where she's trying to also embrace failure in the community. So yeah, very, very nice person that we have in our community. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Oh, great, thank you. I'll apologize in advance that I'm sick today because my husband brings home illnesses from singing in choirs the way toddlers bring home illnesses from daycare. So this week we are sick, but I feel like that is, and yet I'm in the office to work for my startup, which perhaps career advice like don't do a startup is maybe something we'll get to later in the talk. But I called this Finding Log Vectors Toward a Successful Career because I've taken, I think, a pretty unusual career path. Like, path is generous, perhaps, at this point in my career. But I thought I would basically just give you a little background of me, tell you some stories, and give you my general philosophy of advice, which mostly I am very bad at taking. I'm very bad at taking advice and usually ignore it. So I'm going to tell you also some excuses of why it's good to do that on occasion. And then hopefully have a lot of time for questions at the end. So just to give you the sort of snapshot in time of where I currently am in my career, I'm a co-founder and president of a startup which trades stocks for hedge funds. So I design the quantitative models behind our strategies and help run the company. I also teach part-time as a computer science professor at City College in New York City. And on the side, I am a stand-up comedian and perform around the city and sometimes, you know, in rum sessions and other places that that might intersect with the cryptography community. But how I've gotten there is a bit more of a winding story. For many, many years, so probably from when I was like 4 to when I was 20, I wanted to be a novelist, and I was pretty sure about that. And I picked a college as an undergrad for their creative writing program. And I got into that college, and I went to that college, and then I applied for their creative writing course, and I got rejected. And so I was not able to get into creative writing. And instead, I thought, well, while I'm waiting to sort of reapply to the creative writing department, I'll get all my other requirements out of the way. And one of the requirements was quantitative reasoning or some kind of math. And so they wanted me to take, you know, Calc 2 because I'd taken Calc 1 in high school, and I hated Calc 1. I thought it was boring. And so I said, okay, I don't want to take that. What else you've got? And they said you could take number theory. And I thought that number theory sounded like the physics for poets of math. So surely it would just be like the easy class for like the English majors. So I signed up for number theory at Princeton. It turns out it's not the easy class for English majors. It was, you know, a bunch of like Olympiad medalists and state math champions like taking number theory. Luckily, I didn't know any of that, so I just did it. And by the end of it was sort of told like, oh, well, you should keep going. Like you should take linear algebra. And at that point had decided to just like see how far I could go with it until somebody stopped me. And so still kind of waiting for that to happen at some point, but ended up majoring in math, which was funny because my mother was a math major and she did applied math and taught math in high school. And when I called her from undergrad to say I'm changing my major to math, she got really excited and she said, theoretical or applied? And I said, theoretical. And she goes, oh, so close. And so like she thought I was almost on the cusp of like a useful career. which she felt better than when I went to grad school and switched into CS. And I switched into CS in the worst possible way because I did all of my all but dissertation requirements in the math department first. And then I started from scratch. I did all of my all but dissertation requirements in the computer science department. And I did that because I was looking to do math that was sort of more used in practice. I sort of started getting this itch to kind of do more practical, more immediate kind of things. And in theoretical math, I would ask my professors, what are the applications of this? And they would say, oh yeah, it's highly useful in like high dimensional manifold topology and like differential geometry. And I'm like, no, like for people, like what is it useful for people? And they sort of didn't have great answers to that question. So I started wandering into the sort of computer science classes, learning about cryptography, learning about machine learning, and sort of finding that sort of appealed to me more, and ended up switching my major and redoing all my requirements and getting my PhD sort of in computer science, with of course an emphasis in cryptography, in particular pairings-based provable security kind of systems. My thesis had some sort of awful title like advancing capabilities in functional encryption : some other stuff. So that was the sort of things that I was doing at that time. After finishing my PhD, I sort of followed the usual path. I did a postdoc at Microstructure Research, and then I started as a tenure track assistant professor at Columbia. I'm running, a research group, recruiting grad students, applying for grants, all that kind of fun stuff. And it was sort of overwhelming in terms of like, I think one of the things that's surprising about being a professor is that it's actually like 6 jobs and you've only been selected to be good at about 2 of them, and the other 4 is just assumed you'll kind of like figure it out. So luckily I come from a long line of teachers and had spent a lot of time sort of teaching and thinking about teaching. So that part kind of felt good to me and kind of came naturally. Applying to grants was not a thing that came naturally, like caring about publication rates and citations and things like that, and being on committees and dealing with the politics of departments was not a thing that came naturally to me. But overall, that was sort of a good experience. The thing that made me kind of restless in that job was that I felt, that I was teaching students and preparing students for careers in computer science more broadly without knowing anything about that and without sort of like knowing what those kind of jobs in industry were going to look like. And similarly, kind of in my research life, like staring at the whiteboard and saying like, okay, well, we could improve this parameter in broadcast encryption schemes, or we could try to, have encryption policies with this kind of functionality, but not knowing like, well, which ones are worth doing, right? And I feel like grad school was a time where I got really excited about like learning new tools for thinking, and that my way of thinking really progressed, and that felt great. And then I got to a point where I'm like, okay, at this point, I have these tools. What can I do with them and what is worth doing? And I didn't feel like I was in a good position to answer that question of what was worth doing without having some kind of practical experience. And so at first I tried to go out and do this in the typical sort of academic way of having like consulting jobs on the side. And so I started consulting for a stock exchange, which the US system is crazy on this front. I know other countries, the systems are different. In the US, there are actually 16 different stock exchanges right now, and 40 plus like dark pools, which are all places where stock trades every day from 9:30, which hasn't happened yet, which is why my laptop is not screaming with alerts, until 4 p.m. And so you have this crazy decentralized system, and that leads to all sorts of predictable gameability shenanigans where like people try to time, exactly when their orders hit which exchanges and try to get ahead of certain things. And so I started consulting for this for the stock exchange called IEX, which was featured in a Michael Lewis book called Flash Boys. for how they could sort of design their trading infrastructure to be more resilient against certain predatory high-frequency trading practices, which is not something, of course, like cryptography have trained me to do, except that it kind of did, in the sense that it was a lot of like adversarial thinking and like thinking systematically about a distributed system and saying like, all right, here are the kind of threat vectors, here are the kind of things we could do about it. And so I mentioned that just to highlight, I think the kind of thinking that we're trained to do as cryptographers is actually super applicable to like a lot of different areas. And that approach of being systematic about threats, especially, is something that can really be taken importantly into other fields. The actual math, which I have on a slide coming up here, is not very complicated in the stock trading realm compared to the cryptography realm. But the sort of overall like schematic of the problem is very complicated. And I sort of found there that the pace of things was such that being there one day a week was not enough, because I would sort of go in on Mondays and we would talk about something, and then I'd come back the next Monday and they'd be like, so we implemented it and we did this and it didn't work or whatever. And like I would have missed the whole thing. And I'd be like, wait, but why, what exactly did you do and why didn't it work? And they'd be like, oh, we're on to the next thing, we're on to the next thing. And so I found that kind of balance of being 80% academic, 20% industry was not enough was not enough of a foothold in the industry world for me as a person who hadn't been there before to really get up to speed and feel integrated. And so I ended up flipping it and going, full-time in industry and taking a bit of a leave of absence from Columbia while still teaching and advising my PhD students. And then eventually sort of getting to a point where I completely flipped it. I like to describe the story as like a progression of my office getting worse and worse at every decision I was making. So I started at Columbia. I had this great corner office that I could decide like what to paint and everything. And then I went on leave and they gave me this tiny cubicle office. And then eventually they took away my office in the middle of a teaching semester to make room for Tim Roughgarden's books, because he had shipped them ahead of his arrival for the next semester. So in all the talk about people's jobs getting replaced by AI, I like to say I'm probably the first computer science professor replaced by physical books. And during that time, I was sort of working every day on a trading floor. So I sort of had a desk with a bunch of monitors that I did not use, because no one can use that many monitors. When you see sort of like the caricature of like a stock trader bro with all his monitors, I don't know what they're looking at. They only have 2 eyes. It doesn't make sense to me. But that's kind of what the trading floor looks like. And you'd be constantly interrupted and things happening all around you. And then my friend and boss who had brought me in to work for them decided to go off and wanted to start a new company. And so we left in 2019, right before the pandemic. Seemed like a great time to take risk and start a business, to do a startup and build our own sort of broker dealer for U.S. equities. We did Y Combinator, so we moved to the Bay Area for 3 months. Did that to get funding, and then sort of started our business in 2019. We're 5 years in at this point. We're still going. We have a live trading product, and we had a profitable month last month. So fingers crossed, things are going well. But that's been kind of like the journey. And then around that time when I left to do a startup was when I sort of officially resigned my full-time position at Columbia, but pretty much 6 months later already decided that like not teaching just doesn't work for me. Like I love teaching. It's something that is so fun and so rewarding, not only from just like what the students get out of it, but also like just I think the kind of energy it brings into my life and the kind of freshness of perspective. And I think most of my big ideas in research have not come from sort of like standing on the most state-of-the-art complicated thing and like extending it, but have come from revisiting the basics and sort of noticing new connections or sort of new simple things or that can sort of unite things or make them easier. And a lot of that kind of perspective has come from students asking questions, seeing something for the first time and going like, why do we do it that way? And then me going like, starting with the answer of like, well, we should, you know, for 20 years, and then looking at it and going like, wait, why do we do it that way? And so I think for me, at least, teaching is something that is so important as a part of my like balance, and just so important as my output as a researcher, to have sort of like, you know, a leeching kind of access to, you know, fresh brains, is just such a valuable resource as a researcher. And so I started going back to teaching part-time, and so now I kind of have this balance where I'm maybe like, you know, basically 80% industry, 20% sort of academia. So kind of the flip of the usual consulting. And I think in the long term, I'd like to get to a place that's a little bit closer to 50-50. But that's sort of something that neither like industry or academia is kind of set up to let you do. So I've been kind of like, you know, figuring this out as I go along. Okay, let me switch my slide here. But I want to just tell you a couple of stories sort of along the way that I think illustrate some of the biggest things I've learned. And one of them is always ask questions. And my example of this is actually from my first experience in science. So when I was still wanting to be a writer and I was just graduating from high school, my high school happened to be close to Cornell University, just like physically close, just like 5 miles down the road was the only connection we had with Cornell University. And at that time when I was graduating high school, the Mars rover project was in its final testing phase before being sent to Mars. And they had promised some grant agency that they would have high school interns on the summer tests that they were doing at the Jet Propulsion Lab for the last sort of field test before the Mars rover went live. And at the last minute in like June, they were looking for like 2 high schoolers to put on a plane the next week to the Jet Propulsion Lab to be interns for the Mars rover test. And they basically just drove down the road to my high school and like met with my guidance counselor and were like, give us 2 people to put on a plane like tomorrow. And so I got this call to like go and be an intern on the Mars rover project, which was amazing. So like for 2 weeks, I just got to be like a fly on the wall in the back of the room with all the scientists who were like running the field test, which was really cool. And I was given a job that I took very seriously because I wanted to be helpful. And every day they were simulating these real conditions where you had to send commands to the rover and then via satellite as if it were sort of on Mars. And then you'd wait, 12 hours or something, and then you'd get them back because that's sort of what would happen in real life. And the rover would take measurements and pictures with its camera. It had a rotating camera on that mast that you can see in the picture there, and then send back that data in its response to the commands. And my job was to take those files that sent back and like match them up with the instructions that were sent. So be like, okay, you told it to take a picture of that rock. Here is that picture. You told it to take a spectrometer measurement of this. Here is that measurement, and just do the linkage. I just did it in a spreadsheet. And I was told to either email the spreadsheet to a particular like email address. So dutifully, like every day I do this. At the very last meeting of the project, the scientists are talking about like improvements for next time or next sort of thing like this. And they're like, yeah, it would have been really useful to have an intern sort of collating, like matching up the instructions with the data coming back. Like, let's do that for next time. And I was like, wait, what? And by the end of the meeting, I figured out that they had given me the wrong email address to send the spreadsheets to. And I had never asked any kind of follow-up questions of like, was this right? Like, are you getting this? Like, what else do you need? And so the whole week I was doing this job that was not going anywhere. So the moral of this story is ask questions. And there was a similar time where, like, because I had done this job, I knew that like the previous day, they had not instructed it to take pictures. And taking pictures was a prerequisite for movement because they basically used the pictures to sort of plot out a path. And they spent, like 90 minutes of the 2-hour meeting, like arguing where to drive in the instructions they were going to send. And then they were simulating this window of like, you have to send the instructions by this time. And I knew the entire time that they had forgotten that they had not taken pictures and that they couldn't do either of these things that they were arguing about doing. And I, as an 18-year-old, like high school student, was too afraid to say anything or ask and be like, are you sure you took, the pictures? And so I didn't. And then finally in the last, 30 minutes of the meeting, somebody goes like, oh, wait, like we didn't take pictures. We can't do any of this. We have to like totally change. And so like I could have had like this moment of like helping them save time, and I didn't do it because I was afraid of looking stupid for asking a question. And of course the worst that would have happened would be like, oh yeah, we took the pictures, like never mind. So all this is to say, like, yeah, the bad questions are the ones you don't ask. The thing that I took away from this at the time was like, oh, well, I'm not cut out to be a scientist anyway. I'm going to be a novelist, so it's fine. Which of course is not what happened. And I think, that kind of experience is a large motivation for me in doing things like CFAIL. The story of how CFAIL got started is probably a little bit funny because I was leaving Columbia and I had some startup funds that I was going to lose and just revert back to the university if I didn't spend them. And Columbia is a rich university that doesn't need that money. So I sat around thinking about like, what can we do with it instead? And an idea that I'd always wanted to do was to have a conference about failure. And so the original CFAIL was launched as sort of like thinking it would be a one-off, that it was just like, let's spin down my startup grant, let's throw a conference, let's, have a nice conference dinner and like invite speakers and things like that. And it worked out, and we were so not forward thinking that we actually made our Twitter handle like CFAIL 2019 and had to change it to something which is of course CFAIL misspelled if you follow us on Twitter now. But yeah, the amazing lesson of this was like, I thought I had energy and ideas to do like one kind of fun like one-off event. And then as soon as more people got involved, it was like, oh, no, like this is a thing. You have to keep doing this. And the amount of people that in some form have been involved with CFAIL the last 5 years, I'm so grateful. It has been such a sort of fun project, and people have gotten into the spirit and submitted papers, been part of our music videos, and like really embraced that. And I was talking to someone in machine learning about this recently because they have a similar concept of a workshop for failures in machine learning that's called I Can't Believe It's Not Better, which is also a fun name. And for them, they were saying their motivation is very organic to machine learning in the sense that like everybody knows if you're training a supervised learning algorithm, you have to give it the negative examples, right? Like you can't train a model on only positive examples. And I thought thinking about it in that lens is so powerful because it's sort of crazy that in our scientific system, we're trying to train scientists looking only at the positive examples. Like we have one hand tied behind our back for no reason. And it was such a common experience I had in grad school of like writing a proof and then there being one bug. And like there was a lot of good, like complicated, like cool stuff in the proof, but there was one bug and it was unfixable, right? And just like the whole thing died. Or like writing a proof and then discovering like someone else already knew something better. All that kind of stuff was super common. And so, and really invisible, I think, to the rest of the community. And so I'm hoping that things like this can sort of, help push back against that. But the lesson that I learned from doing it was just like, if you have something you're excited about and you just talk to people about it, eventually you get forced to do it, and that's a good thing. And so the more you kind of share these ideas, the better it goes. And then just one sort of note on the experience of like taking things into industry. I think this is a particularly funny one because you can't really see me, but I'm there in this lawsuit between Citadel and the SEC. And so this on the left-hand side of the screen is a logistic regression with like 9 parameters that I built for IEX when I was working there. And this chart where you can see the lines kind of jump is the improvement in the performance of the product that corresponded to. And so these little jumps are just like, we picked a better feature set and we retrained the logistic regression, and it jumped. So the math is like all fits on this little screen. It's just, you know, a 10 parameter logistic regression. This made people so mad that this was part of the infrastructure of the stock exchange that Citadel actually sued the SEC, the securities regulator in the US, over allowing it to trade. And so, so this little line in here about automatically adjusting the price of an order, that's me. That's my formula sort of in the market. Citadel lost the lawsuit, so this is something that is still trading today, although the version of the formula is a newer, better version built by my former PhD student, Luke Kowalczyk. So just to show you though, like part of the thing that was amazing to me was like this math maybe took like, you know, it maybe took like a month to come up with the idea for the better feature set, and maybe like, you know, a month to code it up and test it and like really like make sure everything was working well and like and all that stuff. And then I spent many months sort of on the phone with SEC lawyers explaining to them the concept of a probabilistic model. Like they were really hung up on the fact that like it can be wrong. I was like, yes. And so much so that like our internal like regulation person or regulatory person like would give us so many complaints about the false positive rate that my friend who was my boss there made t-shirts that said false positive, like these like pastel like non-threatening t-shirts with false positive on them that we would wear around the office to like normalize the concept of a false positive, to like get the lawyers comfortable with it. And I bring this up is just to say, like, I think a lot of us have the dream that when we go from academia to practice, we're going to use our cutting edge, really cool, like really fancy, like brains and like math to like make an impact. And it's absolutely not that. Like that never works. It's the math part is easy. The really hard part is getting all the human systems around it to actually use it and to use it correctly. And so yeah, so I just wanted to kind of show you the story. It's like this one is a success story, but there's lots of similar things where it's like we know a better mathematical or technical way to do something, and it gets stuck in regulation, it gets stuck in company politics, it gets stuck because it's not profitable, all that kind of stuff. And so I do think it's a really like useful experience to kind of go back and forth between these worlds, because like the bottlenecks are not what you expect them to be. And then just before I give some general advice, I do want to say something about my philosophy about the topic of advice, because I generally don't like it. There are a lot of times when I'm given advice or when I give advice and it isn't followed or shouldn't be followed. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of my framework for evaluating advice coming into me to see if I think I'm going to follow it. Which is really centered on this question of when does advice work well and when does it not? And I think one of the really important things to remember is the context and the goal of the party giving the advice. And so like you want advice to be coming in to share the same goal, to sort of accept the premise of what you're doing. Because I feel like a lot of times I'm given advice, people sort of assume that my goal is the same as their goal, and it's maybe not. And that sort of, you know, splits the utility of that. And then, of course, there is the knowledge of the person giving you advice. Is it relevant? Is it up to date? And are you in a tenable position to sort of implement that advice successfully? Which I think is something that comes up, especially in industry a lot, where, you know, I get advice about negotiating salary and I'm like, well, that would work better if I were a white man or things like that, right? Like your position might be, you know, different, or I might be able to do that if I had the money to fund my own startup, or, you know, whatever the circumstances are. And so I do think it's important to discount advice that doesn't align with sort of like your goals or your position or your context. And so just to give you the context for advice coming from me, these are a few things about me that are sort of relevant to the sort of career advice that I'm capable of giving. I recently turned 40. I was raised in the US and have mostly lived in the US. I don't have kids. I do have chronic anxiety, so that's something I negotiate in my professional life and personal life. The things I find most important are community, honesty, humor, and creativity, which is not a great fit for finance generally, which is why I sort of, have built my own company in that space instead of working for others. And I do, though, have, I think, a pretty good work-life balance, which is not something I've always had, but something I've sort of worked up to over time. Some things that make me hesitant to give advice as a professional person and make me sort of surprised that I was kind of asked for a career advice. These are real things that I have done. I walked away from a tenure track job at an Ivy League institution that was going well. I turned down a DARPA grant opportunity because I thought the call was stupid. I picked a grad school because my boyfriend went there. I started a company in a space where the primary competitors are places like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. I lost an IACR election by 2 votes, so definitely vote. It does matter. And when I was in grad school, I quit doing everything except grad school, and that was a terrible, terrible decision for me. So I thought I would also share with you a couple examples of the worst advice and best advice that I ever got. The worst advice I ever got, the context of this was that the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton has like a summer program for women in math. And I did that, I think, most years when I was there as an undergrad. And I was standing in line for lunch at one of those meetings. And there were some visiting researchers like giving talks in the line with us. And one of them asked me, like, well, what are you thinking about, or what are you working on? And I answered like 2 different things. Like, I think this was maybe I was just starting grad school, and I'm like, I'm interested in combinatorics and also cryptography or something like that. And the person kind of, frowned and was like, well, you'll be much more successful if you focus on one thing. Which is true for some people. I'm sure there are some people's brains who work that way, who need to sort of focus on one thing. Absolutely false for me. Like, I get the most things done and have the most ideas when I'm working on a minimum of 3 different things at a time, because it's just the way my brain works. I also think, if everybody followed this advice, there would be no interdisciplinary research, which would be horrible. So this is definitely my example of bad advice. I did not take it. Obviously, I am way too incapable of focusing on one thing. But I think it's worth also considering the tendency that people have, that we all have, I think, to project ourselves onto other people and be like, what works for me will work for you. Whereas one of the examples of the best advice I ever got was actually advice about being a writer, and it came from a mathematician. So one of my early mentors in undergrad was Jordan Ellenberg, who is an amazing mathematician who is also a novelist. He has published one sort of fiction novel, and then also some popular math books like How Not to Be Wrong. It's a very fun one with a good title. And he gave me some advice when I was asking him about sort of the decision to major in math versus major in English and keep trying to do creative writing. And he asked me, he's like, well, if you study writing all the time, what are you going to write about? Which I think is such a smart question. And I'm so glad for that, because I've now actually come full circle back to like wanting to focus more on my writing as sort of like a popular science kind of writer, and like try to get better at writing. And I'm taking part-time creative writing classes towards an MFA at City College, like while teaching. I'm doing this like take a class, teach a class thing. And so many of the, things we read and things we work on are like writing about writing, or like feel very circular to me. And it's like having this other career of all these things that I now know about to pull into my writing is such an asset. And so I think this was really good advice, in the sense of like, if you learn other things, you then just have a broader sort of spectrum of topics that you can be a writer about. That being a writer about is not something you have to like do as an isolated thing at any one point in your life. So I think that's an example of good advice. And then just to sort of throw at you before I open it up for questions, some of the things that I typically give people of advice to the extent that they are sort of aligned with your goals or not. I think one of the most important things to be is always trying to be a better teacher. And one of the very simple things that I do for that I do recommend for everyone is to force yourself into the position of being the student who knows nothing constantly. Like every 2 years or so, I try to learn something new that I've never done before. And so right now it's playing drums. So I'm learning to play drums. I am not good at it, but you get to hit things. So it's really fun. So I highly recommend it. It's very hard to find places to do it in New York City, but you can go to like rehearsal studios and things like that. But yeah, this is if thinking about being a better teacher is something on your mind at this point or any point in your career, I think one of the most important things that I found is just to be able to empathize and identify with that feeling of being totally new to something. And the best way is to force yourself into that feeling. And the bonus is you learn, of course, lots of new fun skills, which is great. And then the other thing that I'm coming up against right now as a teacher actually is avoiding solving a systematic problem with an individual solution, and that is sort of adjusting to like ChatGPT in terms of the classroom assignments. So like one thing I'm seeing right now is that I have assignments typically where I have people read papers and then I have them answer a few questions and give a reading summary about those papers. And at this point, of course, everyone is using ChatGPT to write reading summaries. And it's a systematic problem. So I don't want to solve it with like an individual solution of trying to police people up to not doing that, especially for people where it's like English is not their first language. It's very fine line, like what's a helpful use of these tools versus a not helpful. I don't really want to litigate that. I just now have to think about what is a different way that I can extract the information that I need, which is what did they understand or not understand from the paper. So we'll probably be switching to some kind of in-class presentations or things like that. But yeah, whereas I've seen a lot of teachers over the years fall into the trap of if everybody's struggling with something, still using these solutions like giving them worse grades or like policing them or things that are individual solutions, when obviously like it's a systematic problem. If a lot of people are struggling with something, you need to change, the way the course works, not how you discipline individual people. A few pieces of advice on being a better researcher, at least for people who are open or interested in interdisciplinary research, which I think is always sort of where my brain wants to go. One thing that I think is important to remember is that when you're sort of casting the net of like what problems to work on and what papers to read, just the combinatorial explosion of combinations of knowledge makes this kind of like mathematically true, that you're never going to be the only person who has read paper X and has ideas about extending it. But you might be the only person who's read a particular combination of papers. And so if you look for connections between seemingly unconnected things, there's a lot more sort of like ground that we can't as a community all possibly exhaustively cover, like all the different ways that you could blend ideas. And so just the sort of like linear to quadratic to higher degree polynomials that happens when you sort of look at combinations of things. If you're sort of feeling stuck and thinking like, well, everybody's going to have these same ideas, I think one of the good places to look is always in like pairing ideas that don't usually go together. Something that I'm really struggling with in working in finance is the fact that definitions are so important. And I think cryptography gets that really right and like spends a lot of time thinking about security definitions and like what exactly we should be proving and how we should be stating our security goals. If you wander outside of cryptography into industry and cybersecurity or finance or any other domain, I find this really a struggle, that this foundation of good definitions is no longer there. And in finance, people are perfectly willing to sort of like throw around terms without giving them quantitative definitions or formal definitions, and discourse can really get stuck. So I'm spending a lot more of my time, I find, as a researcher on trying to get definitions right, which is just something that maybe it's worth saying, like, is maybe not what you expect when you sort of go into those. Okay, but then I want to leave some time for questions here. So I will perhaps just quickly skip through a little bit of advice about getting a job. One of the most important things I think about this, and one of the things that was worst for me in my progression of getting an academic job and then getting an industry job, is that a lot of people gave me advice about my job talk. And I have found that it ruined it because basically the most important thing about giving a talk or giving a performance of any kind is that you have to enjoy it. Like, if you're excited about what you're saying, excitement is going to come through and people are going to get excited about what you're saying. If you're like nervous, they're going to be nervous for you in like a supportive way. But so the worst thing that happened to me, I think, as I was preparing for job talks or preparing for other talks in grad school, was other people giving advice saying like, oh, well, if it were my talk, I would do it this way. If it were my talk, I would do it that way. And I ended up trying to give a talk that wasn't my talk. You know, not that it wasn't my research, but like the way of presenting it wasn't mine, and I wasn't excited to present it that way. And understandably, it did not go well. And so when you're sort of going through that process, I think it's very normal to think like, oh, well, I want to please as many people as possible and I need to collect all this advice, but just keep, the reminder that the most important thing is that you're going to be able to enjoy what you're doing, because that comes through. And in terms of industry interviews, I had some very strange experiences in industry interviews. I haven't had too many, but they've all been weird. So just a kind of warning on that. Which my one piece of advice there is to sort of get used to that before you do like one that's really crucial. Just to give you one story, I actually got accused of cheating in a finance interview because they gave me a brain teaser question, and the answer to which was in choose two, like it's the most basic object in combinatorics. Like, I did my entire master's degree in combinatorics, like focusing in combinatorics. And so they accused me of cheating when I said I hadn't heard the question before, but then just answered it within choose two. So industry interviews are weird. They're very specific to the exact person doing the interview. Very hard to prepare for. So it's just a thing. It's just a thing to be aware of. And I think the other thing I didn't realize, sort of thinking about this problem of like, moving from academia to industry and like, how do you do it and how do you find things? One of the most important differences is the mindset of how long you expect to be in that job. Because I think for academia, it's like when we think about picking an academic job, it's like, oh, I want to be happy there forever. I want to get tenure. I want to, be there for 30 years. Most industry jobs, like the median time that people spend at Google is like 18 months. And so it's kind of a lower bar for being happy with your first job. Like, it's kind of like, a good dissertation is a done dissertation. A good first job is a job you get, right? And it's also the case that there's always something you can learn from that and leverage into the next thing. So just a thing I think that bears saying that maybe academic people don't always say. If you decide you want to apply for industry jobs, you don't have to have the bar of it being like, I could see myself doing this for 10 years or more. Like, it can be like, oh, I think I'd learn a lot if I did it for a year. Like, that's actually fine. Also, quitting a job. Something that people are very hesitant to tell you to do can be a really great decision. A few things to avoid, of course, if you're quitting an academic job, don't leave your students in the lurch if you can help it. I feel good about that I was able to have my students finish. And also maybe something that people in industry are not as privy to. It's very normal to get a new job and then quit your old job. I've had students, tell me like, well, I feel dishonest sort of interviewing for a new job. And it's like, no, that's what people expect you to do. So just something to know about there. One thing I found really interesting was when I was deciding to sort of step back from my tenure track job and go into industry, I talked to a bunch of other professors about it. And all the other like assistant pre-tenure junior professors were like, oh my God, what are you doing? Like, how can you even be thinking about that? That's crazy. Like, get tenure and then, and then do whatever you want. And all of the older professors or many of the older professors were like, oh yeah, like I totally wish I had done that. Like, I always feel like now I'm too old to go and get some industry experience, but I'm very curious what my, career would have looked like if I had done that. And so, yeah, so it's very telling, I think, the perspective of time at different stages in people's career and what they will advise you to do. But just to put it out there that quitting a job can be a very great decision. My husband would laugh at this slide because he would say that I'm terrible at quitting jobs because I always just end up collecting them, like that I'm still teaching. He'd be like, yeah, it would be great if you could actually quit a job. So that is my version of the problem. And then just to end with something hopefully a little fun. This is just my pitch for why comedy is actually a useful skill for research and teaching in life. One of my favorite teaching reviews I ever got was a rant complaining about me. It was like the one really negative teaching review I ever got, and it was great because he was like, I can't believe spent so much time like making jokes about Bitcoin instead of just telling me how to do the homework. And he then detailed all the things that he learned and remembered from me doing that, and was just angry that we didn't spend that time like going over more examples of exactly how to do the homework. And I'm like, we totally agree, dude. Like, I just think I accomplished what I meant to accomplish. But yeah, but we share the assessment of exactly what happened, which is very funny. Which is how to say, humor can aid memorization. It can help students remember things. It can break through defensiveness or preconceptions. It can highlight connections between seemingly underlying things. In a very cryptography kind of sense, it can reveal underlying patterns. And it can really help us think through the limits of concepts when we take them to extremes. So the same kind of stress testing we do as computer scientists on edge cases, that's also where a lot of humor comes from. And the most important one for me is working in finance, in particular, working in academia, has been using humor as a tool to resist the sort of normalization of things that I don't want to be normal. And so to give you an example of this is a little piece of humor I made about publication inflation. Because I think this is one of those things that we're sort of like in the boiling pot and it just gets a little hotter all the time. And humor is one way that we can remind ourselves that like, actually, this is crazy. Like, it's very crazy, the number of papers we write. And this is just a little piece of humor I did for a similar thing in finance, where I was sitting in a finance conference and they were giving an award for men who support women in finance. And which would be fine if those men had done things like close the gender pay gap at Goldman Sachs. Like, that would be great. But they weren't even like saying what they did. They were just like a list of names as like men who were supportive of women in finance. So I made a comedy sketch about a fake award for men who support women in finance, as just a way to process my feelings about that. And so comedy, I would say, has been like a way that I have kept perspective, and tried to stay grounded in my values while moving in spaces where they aren't necessarily shared. And so that is something I sort of highly recommend to people. All right, I think that is all the slides I had. So I would love to get some questions.